witness on this panel, but she is unwell and had to cancel. But with us today, we have Peggy Shaughnessy, founder, Redpath Consulting, and developer of Redpath programs. Ms. Shaughnessy, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I want to thank each and every one for allowing me to come in front of this committee today, and to all our ancestors for allowing us to come together and to recognize the territory of the Algonquian that we rest our feet upon. If the overrepresentation of Aboriginal peoples within the justice system is ever to be better understood and realistically addressed, a more expansive and imaginative agenda is required. The huge, dusty pile of reports on the overrepresentation of Aboriginal offenders and the persistent rise in these numbers speaks to the lack of any concrete and effective policy action to address the root causes of incarceration. A focus on numbers enables the marking of the Aboriginal body as having a social problem that needs to be solved. Promoting community justice models to address these rates obscures the onus incumbent upon the state to address the relationship between historical injustices and contemporary incarceration. This obscurity highlights the realization that even as the state attempts to address the state's responsibility in law through this sentencing provision, the state remains committed to an understanding of the overrepresentation rates. This result reveals the limitation in the ability of the criminal justice process to attend to the forms of marginalization and structural violence. It also highlights the underlying problems of ways that appeal to tradition and/or culture-appropriate sanctions, which result in nothing more than the creation of certain practices dictated by the state. For over a decade, Redpath healing and wellness programs have been used within the judicial system across Canada. They were originally piloted in then Kingston Penitentiary and Warkworth Institution. This paper will give a brief overview of the development of the Redpath model and give some examples of the outcome of its success. In September of 2003, I was hired by Corrections Service of Canada's Aboriginal Initiative Department, Ontario region, in response to a number of chronic problems occurring within the maximum federal institutions in Ontario. There had been complaints from correctional staff on the behaviors of Aboriginal offenders, and grievances from the correctional staff voicing concerns about the behavior of the Aboriginal offenders. Aboriginal offenders complained about the inability to access elders and cultural-specific programming. As a result of this reciprocal discordance, it was decided that an assessment on the needs of Aboriginal offenders should be conducted to determine what could be done to resolve some of these problems. Until this present study, there has never been an in-depth investigation in the Ontario Federal Correctional System specifically directed at Aboriginal offender needs. This study provided an overview of the needs expressed by Aboriginal offenders who participated in the study. It was hoped that through this examination of the Aboriginal specific needs, that the problems unique to this group would be more effectively addressed. I do not have the time today to go into the outcomes of this assessment, but what is important is that Section 76 of the Correctional Conditional Release Act states that the service shall provide a range of programs designed to address the needs of offenders and contribute to their successful reintegration into the community. This is then furthered in Section 80, which refers to Aboriginal offenders and states programs without limiting the generality of Section 76. The service shall provide programs particularly to address the needs of Aboriginal offenders. The correctional staff was complaining about the behavior of the Aboriginal offenders, yet the Aboriginal offenders were trying to exercise their rights as outlined within the CRA. What was found within this needs assessment was that the Aboriginal population in Ontario was at about 17% of the general population, and at the highest percent of those offenders were part of the 60 scoop. We are all aware of the effects of residential school, and we were not surprised in what we found within the criminal records of those Aboriginal offenders who partook in this study, as they were not only survivors of the 60 scoop era, but also carried the phantom trauma of 5 generations of residential schools. So why is this important? It's important because the last time I asked the stats from the Ontario Region of Correctional Service of Canada, which was last year in 2018, they reported that the Aboriginal population in the federal system in Ontario represents 35% of the population. In 2017, Stats Canada reported that the Indigenous population in Canada continues to rapidly outpace the growth of the rest of the country. The data paints a picture of a young and growing Indigenous population. Between 2006 and 2016, the Indigenous population has grown 425%. That means more opportunity for removal. As Minister Philpott stated, the overrepresentation of Indigenous children and youth in the government care is at a humanitarian crisis. For those of us who have invested our time advocating for Aboriginal rights, it is evident to us that the government does not want to invest in the rehabilitation of Indigenous populations. As a result of this inaction, a high percentage of these youth will find themselves behind the prison wall at some point in their lives. The Government of Canada has known about the injustice against Indigenous people and their community at every step of the game. What has now become known as the Millennium Scoop, is showing that more Aboriginal children are in custody than at the height of the residential school era. As Cindy Blackstock emphasizes, Ottawa is not doing everything they can to make sure that this isn't another generation of First Nation kids that don't have to recover from their childhood. So then, when do the rights of Indigenous people within the justice system begin? When are the laws that have been put in place, directed especially at Aboriginal people, going to be enforced? I have a program, Redpath, that has been proven best practice. Yet the Government of Canada, along with the Province of Ontario, continues to resist, not embrace something that has proven successful. In 2014, Rupert Ross, who was a Crown Attorney for 26 years, retiring in 2011, and most of his prosecution duties involved flying into remote First Nations of northwestern Ontario, wrote a book exploring Indigenous healing, which he devoted an entire chapter on what he explained as Peggy's groundbreaking work in understanding and then responding to that violence within Indigenous communities. The Honourable Madame Justice Deborah Austin reports that there is a disproportionate representation of Aboriginal offenders in the criminal courts in Sarnia, based not only upon the content of the program, but also upon the feedback and results from participants, probation officers, and other workers with offenders. I am confident that the Redpath program is outstanding and important program serving Aboriginal persons involved in the court system. In a very real and positive way, the program helps participants to think differently about themselves and to make positive changes in their lives. I have been most impressed with the enthusiasm of participants and the positive reports from probation officers, the Gladue court worker, lawyers, and others who work with offenders who attend this program. A facilitator from British Columbia working with Aboriginal women coming out of prison stated that every group has been different and amazing as the women are empowered to have a voice, create safety and connection with the group, making choices of what they would like to experience culturally. Redpath has brought big insight to understanding and why they feel the way they do. I have seen a few women heal very deep pain just from understanding the impact of residential schools and the effects it has had on their lives. The self-awareness it has brought to each and every one who has participated is wonderful and fulfilling to watch. I am honored and grateful to be part of their journey. This same facilitator also runs programs for a male halfway house, and one particular offender had a BCR, a banned council resolution, where you can be banned from your community for so long. After the Redpath program, he had the skills to sit in front of his chief and council, and because he had learned to use his voice instead of his fist, he was welcomed back into the community and now is working as a mentor with youth in his community. Other success stories that have been sent to me by facilitators running the Redpath programs, and I'll quickly share these three that she sent me. The,
Oh, in the invitation, you were asked to speak for 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay.
We're now at 10.
okay,
And we do have a copy of your brief,
Okay.
so I'm wondering if
sure, I'll just end it, so after
we
those
could,
three.
and there may be an opportunity
Okay,
to share
sure.
the stories through the questions and responses. Thank you.
Okay, so the Redpath program is a great tool that this facilitator ends with. It is up to the individual to participate and integrate the knowledge into their lives. And there are just some of the, these are just some of the stories from her first time co-facilitating. So I will end with this. It is not hard to predict the future in regard to Aboriginal people within the justice system. We have been talking about the overrepresentation since 1967 in the Lang Report, Indians and the Law. Unless we stop and realize that if programs such as Redpath are not put in place to get to underlying problems of these Aboriginal offenders, then we better start the construction of new facilities now. So let's take a step back and think for a moment. What will our grandchildren, yours and mine, talk about when they meet at these same tables that we sit behind now? Thanks.
Thank you. We have some senators who are ready to ask questions. Senator Cordy, Senator Boyer, Senator Pate, Senator Bresso.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shaughnessy, for being here today and sharing about the Redpath program and the success that this program is showing. And this committee had the opportunity to visit prisons across the country, and it was the first time that I had ever been in a prison. So when the door slams behind you the first time, it's sort of a jarring experience. And it's also a jarring experience when you realize that this is where people are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is their home. And we're studying the human rights of prisoners. And it's important that just because you're locked up, you still have the human rights that are available to all Canadians. And unfortunately, we didn't see that in some cases. I was struck wherever I went by the high percentage of Indigenous population within the prison system. And it started, I'm from Nova Scotia, it started in my home province of Nova Scotia, where the percentage was much higher than it should have been. But you really noticed it when we went to the western provinces, the prairie provinces, and the percentage was significantly high, much higher than it should have been. We did see some Indigenous healing centers, and people who were there spoke very highly of them. And you spoke about your Redpath program and how it is helping people who have had significant trauma within their lives. I guess as a former elementary school teacher, I'm wondering if it can even start earlier than that. What are we doing or not doing to young Indigenous children so that they have the same opportunities that are available to many other Canadians, and so that they don't end up in the judicial system?
Well, I think when you've been surrounded with, a repetition of the colonial violence that continues through colonialism, which isn't a historical thing, it's a continuation through policy, that until we can get to the underlying issues that affect one's life as a result of what they're carrying from, which is different. Each person is different. And so that's what Redpath, what we try to do. Even we have programs for youth, and we do go to communities and try to do work within First Nation communities with the youth. But the problem always goes to, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about getting to the youth or getting whatever, there's never a purse string that's attached to anything that's related to Indigenous people. So it always goes down to nothing can be a continuous thing, because there's never money tied to any of the things that they say they're going to do for Indigenous populations.
It seems that we've been talking about this for quite a long time, and yet maybe you have better numbers, but what I'm reading and seeing, doesn't seem to be significant changes. So are we not putting money in, not the right amount of money? Are we putting it in the wrong places? Something's got to change, because this just isn't, this is Canada, this shouldn't be happening.
And it might be like a whole new day to do more further discussions, but if you look at right from section 80 to 84 within the CCRA, section 81 or 84 coming out into a community, there's no money brought forth just like there are for a halfway house, for instance. So if I went into a discussion with corrections that I wanted to bring somebody out on a section 84 or an 81, then it would be assumed that because of the word culture, that it's similar to a religion, and religion doesn't ask for money, so that for the Indigenous person, they're coming out because somehow they got tied to culture, and there's not a money attached to it because it's not rehabilitation. And that's where the problem is. It's how one can talk about culture and get away without not have to pay for it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Boyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Shaughnessy, for coming today and for giving us that great overview. I have a question about the program itself. How do people access the Redpath program, and what is involved to do that? And how do you actually help participants to think differently about themselves and to make the positive changes that you've described?
So currently, we train people within communities as facilitators. So the community itself puts proposals usually to wherever the department within Canada in order to get the money in order for us to come and train. And often they might be an ADAP worker or a child worker within their communities, and then they run the program within their communities. So the program, depending, because we have several different ones, but let's say for addictions or living without violence, they go through a process, we call it, which is the Redpath model. And we work with them so that it gets to the underlying issue. So just like any other program, it's sessions in a module, but what we're looking at is not the behavior, but the underlying issues on why the behavior occurred. And so, often people will go through the program more than once because they're starting to uncover certain things on why they're behaving like they are, or, oh, it was that, I thought that was just me. Like, there's many different things that they go through in order to, at the end, come out realizing why they were doing that behavior in the first place. And that's the biggest thing on, my grandma didn't hate me because it was the residential school or whatever it may be. And all your life you're thinking that it's something that it wasn't even. And so often we'll see participants not only go through it more than once, but because of their own journey, they want to then become facilitators within the program. One of the biggest problems we're having is the government won't pay. Let's say there's a place in Sarnia at the end of Good Shepherd, but the government won't pay, but the county came along and saw how great the participants were coming from the courts and not going to prison, that the county then put the money in, but the province or the federal government wouldn't put money into it. So our office is always helping them try to get money from somewhere, but it continues. Presently, we have 50 communities that want to be trained in Redpath, but they're having difficulty at the federal government level getting it passed to be able to be trained. So,
Just a quick supplementary question. So have you had evaluations done on the program?
So just recently, Lakehead University just did an evaluation. I can send you that, and in Redpath's one of them. Actually, Redpath is the only program out of their whole report that Suboxone isn't tied with it.
Okay, and the recidivism rate, has that changed at all? Do we know?
There's never been really in that depth.
Okay.
I could say yes, but I that's just something, that part hasn't been evaluated. The program itself has been, though.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Pate, followed by Senator Bressa.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you, Ms. Shaughnessy, for attending and for the work that you've been doing for many, many years in this area. You mentioned in your presentation Section 76, the requirement for programming to be provided, and Section 80. When we talk about Indigenous women in particular, who are the fastest growing prison population, as you're no doubt aware, Section 77 also puts an added obligation on corrections to provide services that are specific to Indigenous women to assist with their community release. And you mentioned that you've been advised by corrections there's no money available for Section 81 and 84 arrangements, yet the legislation, when the Corrections and Conditional Release Act was being brought into place, the clear legislative intent of those provisions was to actually decrease the number of Indigenous people in prison. And so that sounds to me like a policy decision to not allow individuals like yourselves and groups like yours to provide these sorts of services. Have you looked at what C-83, the new bill, will do in terms of it actually further limits the application of Section 81 and 84, and are you able to comment on what the implications of that for you ever getting resources from corrections through those provisions if it's passed?
I can't really answer to Section 83, but it makes me smile when I hear you talk about Section 80 to 84, 81 to 84, even 80, because programs within corrections themselves are usually the elder coming in to do a sweat. Why is that called a program? You look at the GLADU, which was brought in under Section 718.2e to reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people. We all know that number's increased. And we also wonder, why was Section 718.2 even put into the sentencing section of the criminal code? Because an Indigenous offender has to plead guilty prior to even going into a GLADU, so he or she will always still be a statistic under the overrepresentation by just pleading guilty. So the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people, the laws that have been put in place for Aboriginal people, have only helped to increase that. So I don't know enough about Section 83 to comment here today, but I will be looking more deep into it. But corrections I brought out the second Section 84 in Ontario, and it had been in place for a lot of years prior to that. And I tried to get money for an elder for a fast and all that kind of stuff, and I was always told, well, we don't have enough money. So there's never ever been money tied to policy or when you're in relation to Indigenous people, I would argue. So is it going to restrict us? Not much more than it already had before.
Mm-hmm. So just to be clear, the new legislation, Bill C-83, will actually make it harder for individuals like you to access resources. It's already if I'm hearing accurately, it's already difficult, in fact impossible, to access those services, even when the law right now allows you to.
Yeah.
It's the policies that have prevented you. Now, if the law changes, it will even prevent you legally from doing it. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of what opportunities would be available, Senator Cordy asked you about the need for early intervention, and Senator Boyer talked about the work you've been doing. Could you give us an idea of what the relative cost? We know what the cost is to keep people in prison, but what's the relative cost for you to provide sort of the optimum support if you had all of the resources to assist elders and adequately compensate them for their time and that sort of thing? What would be the relative cost per person of the types of interventions you provide?
So
I know it's not. Sorry, I don't.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to diminish. My apologies for interrupting you before you start.
No.
I don't mean to diminish this to a fiscal thing, but certainly the human and social cost you've covered very well. What would be the fiscal difference?
So currently, we just did a training for 5 First Nation communities in Sioux Lookout. We're working with an obstetrician who's going to do a study for 2 years looking at women that are pregnant and on Suboxone, and they're going to try to use Redpath to get to the underlying problems to get the women off the Suboxone. And so I know that training, because it didn't come all to me, but just for getting those women that were being trained out of their communities to Sioux Lookout for their cost for food and all of those types of and so for 5 communities, that training cost them about $80,000. Now that didn't come to me, but that was just for the training itself, and then they already have that position. They're going back into their community. The proposals that are in front of Health Canada and in front of Indigenous Services right now that communities have put in, that $50,000 per community, where we would train them to be facilitators, and my staff would, via camera, go in and run 2 programs for them throughout the year to give them that support and that give them the support that they needed for that 1 year.
Just supplementary, if I may, Madam Chair. You may know the figures already, but the most recent figures from the Parliamentary Budget Officer say that for those who are in segregation, women in particular, so Indigenous women who are overrepresented, as we know from the numbers that the correctional investigator and corrections themselves have gathered, it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 per woman per year to keep them in custody. What kind of services and how many people could you provide support to for that kind of resource?
I'd probably run out of numbers, like for what you could do for what's being done inside a prison. We all know that it would be much less than that. I don't want to just say off the top of my head, but I know that that's an awful lot of money that for those women that aren't going to come out rehabilitated. Just we've talked about before, like if you brought a Section 81 or 84, you're probably looking at $100,000 for all the cares that needed for that person. But again, that's just a ballpark figure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Brasso.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Shaughnessy, for being here and for your presentation. I just have a quick question with respect to something that just jumped out of my face when you said that, in other words, advocates of Aboriginal peoples and their rights, and in this particular case, prisoners' rights, that in other words, governments don't want to invest in the rehabilitation of Indigenous peoples. In your opinion, and regardless of political stripe and color, in terms of governments, why do you think that is?
I have to be polite here.
Please don't.
Well, you go right back to the Indian Act and the construct of what one was called an Indian to policies that now we have a race within the law, that a law was supposed to be, colorless to begin with, and now we're putting Aboriginal right in the law. And, the only race that's ever been identified under the law, which was under the Indian Act, and continues to be identified under the law through every other part forward. So you tell me, why is that? Why is Aboriginal people continue being mentioned within the law when you look at a lot of lawyers around this table, proportionality and all of those things? So if you're going to put it in the law, then it goes back to the ladies prior to me. Who's the watchdog when you have jurisdictional problems to begin with? You have somebody in front of the courts that's in the province of Ontario that, how does the Supreme Court, Gladue and Apilli and everything that followed it, how is that applied then across the country? That, if you're in Northwest Territories or Baffin region or anywhere, it takes on a different meaning. So, but it's in the law. So if it's in the law and it's coming down from the Supreme Court, which, the federal government, then who's the watchdog? And it goes back to that. Who's the watchdog that makes sure, and where does the law stop? So if the courts say that in a Gladue that they have to have alternatives to programming, is it up to the parole officer then to continue the law? And who decides then what is an alternative to what's put down from the court? So where does the law start? Who watches it? Especially with Indigenous populations, which is the federal government under Section 9124. Who's the watchdog? Are you the watchdog? Who's the watchdog when you're going to mention a race within the law? And the only race that's mentioned in the law is Indigenous people.
So I guess, obviously there are programs out there that are effective, they work.
I have one.
You have success stories. Why is there reluctance by the part of governments not to implement these things for the benefit of Aboriginal peoples? Do you believe there's racism still?
Of course there is. I'll tell you a really quick story here. I wrote The High Intensity Family. I was commissioned by the National Headquarters of Canada to write The High Intensity Family Violence for All Aboriginal Offenders in Canada. Okay. So I start writing it. First they give me this program. I said, I can't just tidy this up. I got to start over. 72-day program. There's a high-intensity family violence for non-Aboriginal offenders, which has a psychologist and a facilitator. So they asked me at the national level, well, what will you need for this? Well, I'll need an elder and I'll need a facilitator. Oh, we can't afford that. What can't you afford? Psychologist elder, I'm sure there's a bit of pay difference there. I didn't say that. So they collect, or they gather elders from across Canada. We go to Winnipeg. Joe Couture is alive then, and he's overseeing it. They bring the bundle in. We have 3 days. The elders bless what I did. We smoke the pipe, okay? All of us smoke the pipe. We go our own ways. Corrections comes back, goes to Ottawa, puts their cognitive-based skills in it, and that's the program that's there today. We smoked a pipe that the elders okayed what we smoked the pipe for. So that's where the difference is.
Well, thank you for that, and I wish you luck with your candidacy
Thanks.
to your PhD.
Thank you.
Senator Cormier.
Je vais.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Okay, just to be sure that you understand. So, thank you very much for your presentation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you ever so much for your presentation. You mentioned cultural issues. You talked about funding issues linked to the fact that First Nations rights were exclusively associated to one single culture. My question has to do with your program, and perhaps it's not adequate because I haven't read much about your program. We know that arts and culture are tools and a means to build bridges between various cultural communities, to help towards rehabilitation, to help prevention and rehabilitation. Within your program, or through any other initiative, can you talk to us about the role that arts and culture could play so that we may better understand issues that are faced by First Nations?
Thank you. I'm going to try to say this how I'm going to say it, and hopefully you understand it, because often I think the biggest problem that we experience is that we think the culture component is what is needed, and it's much deeper than that. Rupert Ross, and I expand from what he wrote in a paper one time, that there's a meadow and you have 2 scientists going to be in that meadow, and one scientist is a non-native and the other is an Indigenous scientist. And they go into the meadow and there's this plant. And the non-native needs to take that plant out of the meadow and take it back to the institution so he can, or she can dissect it and find the names maybe, or create the names and look at what that plant was. Where the Indigenous scientist goes into the meadow and sees where that plant is in the meadow and what the responsibility of that plant is and what the relationship that plant has with everything around it, what comes to that plant, what it takes away. And for Redpath, if you look at Indigenous people, they were taken out of the meadow individually and placed in an institution, whatever, which one you want to call. And they might have been named something different, and their culture eventually eroded, okay? We're trying to put them back in the meadow so that they know what they bring to the meadow and what they take from the meadow and what their relationship is to each thing and what responsibility we have in the meadow. And I know that is sort of an analogy, but it's the easiest way for me to explain because of that cultural difference. But it isn't cultural per se, is what people understand as culture. And I think that is where the confusion starts, is because of the communication on that it's so hard to explain it that you can't understand it. Do you see what I mean? So that in the long, long run, we're trying to get through exercises and storytelling and everything that you would have in your program, I have in mine also, but we're going at it from a different angle, just like those 2 scientists.
Mm-hmm. Alors,
And so if I understand, the solution would be to help the general population to better understand a First Nations approach to culture. How do we do that in the first place?
Well, I think we're in an era, we just got through the era of apology, I think, and we're trying to get into an era of reconciliation. And so I think it gets to the point on what each responsibility on each side has. And it's when I talk, I've given a presentation at every single level of government that there's possible, from Health Canada to when Minister Philpott was the head of Health Canada. Minister Bennett is a big applauds all of my work, and she's tried to get me in many things over the years, and it's just become so frustrating because they'll say, well, do you have social workers and psychologists working for you? And you want to yell and scream. And my last comprehensive exam was on professionalism, trying to figure out why the government thinks all of those things are so wonderful, because we're still in a lot of trouble. And so I know a lot more about the professionalism, but I think they say, well, we'll put you over here in the culture if they need you, but culture is like religion, there's no money, and we'll send you there if they ask for you. And so it's our program over here and this program over here, and that's what needs to get that. When do we become is qualified? That when will they listen? Even when you have something for 12 years that is best practice, and judges and everybody wanting it, but the government doesn't seem to listen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Shaughnessy, for being here, for sharing with us information about your program. And it's clear from what you've shared that you've highlighted the need for action and the need for change. And that is probably most clearly articulated in your closing remarks, and I'm going to quote you. Let us take a step back and think for a moment, what will our grandchildren, yours and mine, talk about when they meet at these same tables that we sit behind now? That statement in itself has had a profound impact on me, and I'm sure on my colleagues, so I want to thank you for being here with us today. Thank you.